Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Cannabis Coast to Coast News. This is the B Block. I'm the executive producer of this show, Jimmy Young, filling in for Elena Pinto. And now it's time for our weekly look at the international cannabis news scene. And the country of France is softening its stance on medical cannabis. And that pilot program that they started is moving forward. With more from across the pond, here's Dave Barton.
I'm Dave Barton from Thermador with your international cannabis report for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. This week across Europe and the UK, cannabis news focused on enforcement, clarity, regulatory momentum, and market positioning. In North Macedonia, authorities carried out the largest cannabis seizure in the country's history, confiscating 28 tons from industrial facilities, underscoring the enforcement challenges that persist even where medical cultivation is legal. In the United Kingdom, the College of Policing published new national guidance for officers encountering medical cannabis patients. However, the lack of a coordinated training rolled out has raised concerns about inconsistent enforcement across police forces. In France, long-delayed medical cannabis regulations are now expected to move forward after recent political and budgetary obstacles were cleared, a key step towards transitioning the program out of pilot mode. And in Germany, international operators continue to strengthen their presences, with new Europe-focused initiatives signaling ongoing confidence in Germany's role as the continent's leading medical cannabis market. That's all for this week. I'm Dave Barton from Thermador with your international cannabis report for Cannabis Coast to Coast News.
This is Debi Facey with the Canadian Coast to Coast Cannabis News Report. So what we have in Canada this week was the Brands and Buds, which is a seasonal sesh gathering, and it is a culture-driven community engagement event where it is bringing the individuals within the cannabis industry together for an evening of education, live activations, as well as networking within the community, which is a great way for us to come together. Also, what we have is Alberta, which is requesting their overall $1 billion in revenue that they had paid to taxes to go back into the cannabis industry to help them thrive, which isn't a bad idea. Hopefully the government does agree with the industry out there because of the fact that cannabis is needed, especially the education and any other further sort of development when it comes to products. When it comes to Canada, this is pretty much what we have. This is Debi Facey with the Canadian Coast to Coast Cannabis News Report. Peace.
One state that has never been especially friendly to cannabis is Idaho, where possession remains a crime punishable by a hefty misdemeanor fine. Every attempt to legalize cannabis in the state has failed. Idaho does allow the anti-seizure medication Epidiolex, one of the few FDA-approved CBD medications. But beyond that, the sale, possession, cultivation, and consumption of cannabis remain illegal. Many consider Idaho's cannabis laws to be one of the strictest in the nation. Now, a new ballot initiative is aiming to put the issue directly in front of voters, and organizers say they've already collected more than 45,000 signatures. But if Nebraska is any indication, even voter-approved legalization, whether for adult use or medical cannabis, can still face serious obstacles. Citizen-led initiatives remain subject to changes driven by political agendas at the state level. In Nebraska, the founder of Nebraskans for Medical Marijuana, Crista Eggers, is currently battling state leaders, including a prohibition-minded governor and attorney general, over the implementation of medical cannabis program that passed more than 70% voter approval. Now, just 3 months after accepting the volunteer role, the current head of the program has resigned. Here's what Crista had to say about the latest developments in her state.
This last week, we saw the main individual that the governor had appointed to the Medical Cannabis Commission for the implementation phase. She resigned. She was appointed last April by the governor, very much handpicked for her prohibitionist attitude to cannabis and medical cannabis. And so, it's no surprise that we see this resignation. This is actually the fourth resignation that this committee as an entirety has seen. The first was early on when one of the individuals was asked to not reapply so that they could find somebody more versed in cannabis. And then he went on to appoint two individuals, this one who just resigned, who again are lifelong prohibitionists working on the other side of the aisle of advocates for, over a decade. And then a few months ago, there were two other cannabis commissioners that the governor asked to resign. And one of them had become a little bit more outspoken and was definitely more of an advocate and not happy with the way this commission is dismantling the program. So it's a direct reflection, I think, of the people that have been put in there. There's a huge amount of public scrutiny. This commission is in charge of rules and regulations surrounding the industry, not the patient side, not the physician side. But what we have seen them do with their rules and regulations is completely dismantle what voters passed and say that they know better. Voters didn't know. This is not what voters intended. And here instead is what we're going to give you. Currently, the rules and regulations violate the voter statute in many ways with the restriction of products, THC caps, and they've just whittled this program down to something that even industry, folks that are starting to get these licenses, I think are very scared. Is this a program that can even survive?
There's an interesting story about the impact on opioid use in states where cannabis legalized. The Boston University School of Public Health published results from a study that showed a 9 to 11% decline in daily opioid use in legal adult use cannabis states. The study was published in the Journal of Drug and Alcohol Dependence. Opioids are still responsible for 75% of overdoses in this country. Researchers conclude that increased legal access to cannabis can lead individuals to substitute their use of the toxic and unstable opioids for some use of cannabis. Now let's check in with Amie Carter in Michigan, where that state continues to adapt to the new 24% taxes. Here's Amie.
I'm Amie Carter with Michigan Weedsters for this week's Michigan Report for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. Consumers beware. Crossing into Wisconsin with Michigan cannabis, be careful. There are reports of increased stops and searches near the Upper Peninsula border. After a string of smash and grab incidents, some Michigan dispensaries, especially in the southeast, are adding extra security measures. Law enforcement warns the trend may continue in waves. Michigan's Cannabis Regulatory Agency has filed a formal complaint against a major Walled Lake cannabis safety testing lab, Prism Triangle, accused of using improper testing methods that could have made some lab results unreliable. The lab says it did nothing wrong. And lastly, this week, Detroit Tigers shortstop Javier Baez will not suit up for Puerto Rico in the 2026 World Baseball Classic due to a cannabis-related suspension stemming from a positive test during the 2023 tournament. I am Amie Carter with Michigan Weedsters for this week's Cannabis Coast to Coast News.
There are many celebrities invested in the cannabis industry, and many come from sports, entertainment, or musical backgrounds. Case in point is the legendary 92-year-old Willie Nelson, who has a THC-infused beverage line called Willie's Remedy. That group just raised $15 million in capital to expand their national distribution. In less than a year after the launch of Willie's Remedy, they have already sold more than 400,000 bottles. Willie doesn't smoke it anymore, and nano-soluble infusion in beverages is booming. So he's been able to adapt on a personal and business basis. Now let's check in on Curtis Emery in Massachusetts.
I'm Curtis Emery, a bud tender for Resonate in Worcester, Massachusetts, with the Bay State Report for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. Big news week this week here in Massachusetts. Top story this week, the CCC has put together a working group which aims to cut red tape in the cannabis industry here in the Bay State. Rules have been in place since the industry went live in 2018, but now it's time to take a second look at some of the laws that are put into place, regulations that were aimed to keep the industry safe and grow well. Those include a variety of subjects, including retail training, as well as employee ID badging, and other effects which will be felt on the sales floor, including the requirement that customers show their ID twice, once at the door and once at the POS system. Now, the idea here is that it will alleviate some of the financial burdens on the cannabis dispensaries and companies here in the state, as well as making it more fluid and easy experience for the customers to get in, buy their product, and leave as we slowly try to overhaul the cannabis industry here in Massachusetts to make it a bit more accessible and a bit more advantageous for the customer. Also in the news, the city of Malden is ordered to pay $18,000 to Benevolent Botanicals. The city of Malden erroneously capped its allowance for dispensaries at 2 rather than 5 or more, which is state law. Now, Benevolent Botanicals had been approved to open a dispensary, but has been in limbo since 2021, where finally they see some justice. The state has now ordered Malden to allow them to open up as well as pay fines. Yes, it seemed as cannabis was rigged in broad daylight, but the state has finally, even though it's been a while, brought justice to that situation. I've been Curtis Emery with the Bay State Report, Cannabis Coast to Coast News.
I'm Jennifer Boozer Stewart, reporting from Alabama for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. Alabama Civil Court appeals on Friday overturned a lower court order that halted the state's medical cannabis licensing process, ruling that Montgomery Circuit Court lacked authority to intervene. In a unanimous decision, the appeals court dismissed multiple appeals and granted a writ of mandamus sought by the Alabama Cannabis Commission, directing the circuit court to dismiss a lawsuit brought by several unsuccessful license applicants, including Gemstone Alabama LLC. The court held that the trial court lacked subject matter jurisdiction to issue an injunction blocking the commission's December 2023 licensing decisions, rendering the lower court's April 2025 order void. Judges said challenges to the licensing process were premature because the commission has not yet issued final licenses and remains in the investigative hearing phase required under state law. The ruling clears another legal hurdle for Alabama's long-delayed medical marijuana program, which has been tied up in litigation for more than 4 years. It has now been more than 40 days since HB 445 went into full effect, and no licenses for retailers have been issued. The city of Mobile, Alabama has come up with some way to help shop supplying within the city limits. The Mobile City Council will vote on February 10th on a new rule for stores that sell consumable hemp products. The rule sets up a 90-day transition period for certain stores to get licensed and approved. Who this affects? The stores that are selling hemp products before January 1st, 2026. They now need to follow state law and get approval from the city. Only retailers with a license from the Alabama Alcoholic Beverage Control Board can sell consumable hemp products. Stores also need local approval from the city where they are located. What the 90-day period does is allows the city to choose to be flexible on a case-by-case basis, but the stores must submit a full ABC license application during those 90 days, keep proof of the application on site at all times, stay in compliance with all other city rules. The city can end this flexibility if a license is denied, a store does not pursue licensure, or there are safety or compliance problems. The council will review each store's location before approving it for the ABC license. They may consider zoning and land use, the surrounding neighborhood, past code violations, safety, traffic, or operational concerns. Other site-specific factors. These are guidelines, not a guarantee of approval. If approved, the city official will issue the local approval letter needed for the ABC license. This rule does not create a city license or change the ABC board's authority. Effective immediately, if the council adopts the rule, it goes into effect right away. I'm Jennifer Boozer Stewart, reporting from Alabama for Cannabis Coast to Coast News.
The fight to regulate, not ban, hemp-derived products in Texas continues. At a recent cannabis conference in the Lone Star State, 2 bipartisan lawmakers told attendees that with federal prohibition laws beginning to soften, now may be the right time for Texas to put clear regulatory rules in place for hemp. It's another example of the trickle-down effect following President Trump's executive order to begin the process of cannabis rescheduling. Now let's check in with Kerry Hinkle with our weekly hemp report.
I'm Kerry Hinkle with Bayou City Hemp out of Houston, Texas, and I am back with another hemp report for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. This week, we stay in the Lone Star State as all things hemp policy never seem to slow down in our own backyard. There is a cannabis policy conference that happens every year in Austin, Texas, where our CEO, Jeremy Sherman, was lucky enough to serve on a panel and discuss what it's like to operate a hemp beverage business in the state of Texas. But this conference made other news as a Democratic Senator, Nathan Johnson, and a House Republican, Drew Darby, were serving on a panel and made remarks that while marijuana legalization is still unlikely in the state, hemp products are here to stay and likely to have a stronger regulatory framework when they come back in session in 2027. Now, it's important to note that these lawmakers make these remarks on the backs of Governor Abbott's veto of SB 3, which was the outright ban on hemp products that was being pushed by Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick and their months-long feud over this issue. We don't think Dan Patrick's going to let up come next session, but having both House and Senate support publicly like this is a strong indication that hemp products will remain legal in the state. And it's also importantly timed as the regulatory body responsible for ensuring that hemp products are regulated in the state, DHS, are currently going through proposed rulemaking where they want to charge $20,000 per retail location to sell consumable hemp products. Now, I think the intent here was to eliminate some of the vape shops and gas stations that may not want to pay that high of a retail fee to continue selling hemp products, but I don't think they had understood the business implications of big box retailers. For example, our company just launched in 60 different Sprouts throughout Texas, and there's no way Sprouts is going to pay $20,000 for each location just to sell some hemp beverages. The velocity, the retail, the margins are not there to justify $20,000 per retail location. So DHS recently publicly stated that they received thousands of comments. It's going to take them months to review. And so we're going to patiently await as the final rules will come out, and we'll see where that retail fee lands. But as the governor's office and lawmakers like Senator Nathan Johnson and House Republican member Drew Darby continue to signal favoritism towards the hemp industry, we hope DHS takes these into consideration as they come out with their final rules. Again, hemp policy never seems to slow down in Lone Star State, even though we're out of session. So I'm Kerry Hinkle with Bayou City Hemp and Cannabis Coast to Coast News. We'll see you again next week.
There are three distinct factions in the cannabis world: the legacy, the hemp, and the legal cannabis one. Bringing those three together behind a single voice is going to be a huge challenge in 2026 and in the future. Executive producer Jimmy Young spoke with Kentucky advocate Martin Smith for his 1B1 special report, where they talked at length about how to unite these three factions at the state and federal levels.
Martin Smith is the president of the Medical Hemp Farmers Association of Kentucky and America. He joins us now. Martin, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Jimmy. How are you today? I mean, here we are talking about cannabis again.
Yeah, I think it's great. And I'm definitely going to get into your common sense philosophy of we know enough about this plant. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
That being said, tell me a little bit more about your journey with the cannabis plant. And I'm very familiar with what's going on in Kentucky and your governor there, who's been waving the pro-cannabis flag now for a number of years. And I know you're just starting your market. I also know that the first store that opened in Kentucky ran out of product in the first 10 days, right?
Yeah, so that's a whole different, arena than what we are in the hemp industry. Obviously, we're talking there. You're talking about medical cannabis.
Yes,
that's we passed that law here, and they've got the licenses out, and doors are opening. We're on the other side of the spectrum when it comes to industrial hemp, making hemp that's industrialized for textiles and things of that nature, and also into the full spectrum CBD aspect of hemp, where we're, on the other side of the CSA, I would say.
Well, we both agree that the CSA, the Controlled Substances Act, needs to be rewritten. And that was one thing that we bonded on immediately. And I've been saying that now for years because we know so much more about this plant. And it's funny, the plant is cannabis sativa. The government of the United States defined a legal version of it back in the Farm Bill of 2018. Kentucky had a lot of influence on the signing of that Farm Bill back in 2018 because your Senator, Mitch McConnell, helped push that through, didn't it? Didn't he?
Yep, and there's also a lot of advocacy work here in the state. We had passed prior to that happening, and matter of fact, very many people didn't think President Obama was going to sign the 2014 Farm Bill, but we had worked in the state to pass SB 50, which basically said that if the government does, recognize hemp as a legal product, that our state law would align with whatever the government said, and so that triggered the process for how do you enact it. As soon as he signed it, it was, now we got to enact something, and so we started down the road with MOUs, memorandums of understanding, which basically said if the feds change their mind, you're on your own. So it made our lives a little. You slept less at night once signing that, and but we pushed forward through it, and we've made stride after stride, and we're about to make the biggest stride in Kentucky with HB 532. It's a bill that's going to really set the tone for the executive order that President Trump had signed on December 18th on the rescheduling. But inside of there, full spectrum CBD, and telling the agencies of government to work to get that to the Medicare recipient who's 65 years and older. And so that's a new market for us. And so we're excited about that. So we went to writing, and I wrote a lot of cannabis law here in Kentucky, and that turned into law here in Kentucky and got adapted in the 2018 Farm Bill. I had written the protections. I was trying to protect the farmer on my side with getting the isomers and the salts and acids and salts of isomers off of the scale when it come to weigh in the 0.3%, because it's just a trace acid. And so changing that, the dry weather changed it in 2019, and we had to burn a whole lot of crops. And then, but it did. In that it created that loophole for all of the Delta conversions, and they, the industry went down the pathway of, the intoxicating substances with the Delta 8s and 9s and 10s and, double zeros and all the other, H's and HCs. And it's just, the laboratories went, down that road with it. And of course, now we are back at the table with our full spectrum, trying to give us a lane to stay in to qualify for that Medicare recipient benefit when it gets done, based on this executive order.
There's a story out of Ohio this week that's pretty bizarre, as that state is now seeing an alleged act of collusion among multi-state operators who sell their products in that market. Ohio Attorney General Dave Yost is accusing 9 MSOs of engaging in anti-competitive conduct to control the flow of product and price in that state. Those MSOs who are being targeted are some of the biggest ones in the country: Curaleaf, Ascend Wellness, Columbia Care, Cresco Labs, Green Thumb Industries, Jushi Holdings, Air Wellness, Trulieve, and Verano Holdings. Yost lawsuit says that these operators were allegedly conspiring in, quote, anti-competitive conduct to reduce product choice and keep prices artificially high, unquote. With more from Ohio, here's our correspondent, Christina Brisson.
Hi, I'm Christina Brisson with Over the Top Renovations with your weekly Ohio Cannabis Report with Cannabis Coast to Coast News. So just a little quick review for this week here. We're going to talk about that sales revenue. If you remember, it all got held up until SB 56 got approved, and now they've been releasing those funds. Well, let's see how things can look a little different by state. Since Michigan right here is close by, Michigan gets their sales based on the number of licenses in each section city, or however they are broken up. So that's how those municipalities are paid. Whereas ours are paid on commission based on the amount of sales you have. So Columbus saw $4.7 million come to them for last year's sales, whereas Detroit saw $3.14 million. So far it's looking a little better for the sales base, but that said, smaller towns are obviously seeing less. Now, the way it was approved for voter registration or voter cannabis when we put it into law was that it would be a 10% tax, and of that 10% tax, 36% goes to municipalities. So with the newer version of SB 56, it does change the allocation. I'm not saying a lot about which city it affects or how it's going to affect each individual city, but more about each individual fund the money goes into. But they are talking about, with SB 56, raising the tax to 20 to 25%, which would be one of the highest in the United States. So I think it's going to push business more out of Ohio, not into Ohio. So that is your weekly update. I am Christina Brisson with Over the Top Renovations with your weekly Ohio Cannabis Report with Cannabis Coast to Coast News.
We all knew that going into this year, merger, acquisition, and debt service was going to be an industry focus. Now, in the first month of the year, there certainly has been a lot of movement. One of the MSOs that's being sued by that Ohio AG is Air Wellness. What impact might that have on its stock? Well, that's why we have Doug Miller to analyze that in his High on Wall Street report.
I'm Doug Miller from High on Wall Street with this week's Cannabis Stock Report for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. Cannabis MSO Air Wellness has sold its Ohio cultivation facility for $28.5 million. But here's the key. Air isn't going anywhere. The 58,600 square foot cultivation site in Parma, Ohio, sitting on 3.4 acres, was originally sold to cannabis-focused real estate investment trust Valentine back in 2022. That property's now changed hands again, purchased by Parma Propco, an entity tied to New York-based Power REIT. Even after the sale, Air Wellness will continue operating the facility, using it to grow cannabis for the Ohio market. That's critical, especially after Air opened a new adult dispensary in Parma in November. This sale also comes after Air's major restructuring, where the company cut its debt by roughly 50% and is now owned by former creditors. A reset many MSOs are navigating right now. Ohio just wrapped up its first full year adult use cannabis, generating $836 million in recreational sales and $233 million in medical sales, with a total cannabis revenue in Ohio of $1.06 billion in 2025. So let's see how Air Wellness's stock chart looks. It does trade as an OTC, and the stock ticker is AYRWF, and it's trading a little under 2 cents. It has been bouncing around right now, so it will take a catalyst to get it moving, and I'll be watching for that. So be sure to always trade smart and lock in those profits. And that's this week's Cannabis Stock Report. Reporting for Cannabis Coast to Coast News, I'm Doug Miller.
And finally tonight, one of the great so-called Hallmark holidays is Valentine's Day, and that is coming up next weekend. And to be honest, it puts a lot of pressure on anyone who's in a relationship. Now, if you really want to go overboard and give your Valentine a once-in-a-lifetime experience, there's a New York City dispensary called The Daily Green that's come up with something that's pretty unique. And it's a little over the top, too, because the cost is $6,000, okay? Now, you can have your image and your Valentine's image on one of the video billboards in Times Square, which happens to be where that dispensary is located. But wait, there's more. It includes luxury accommodations, a gourmet dinner at one of New York's 5-star restaurants, plenty of edible sweets and gifts, and of course a selection of their finest cannabis flower. One thing you can always count on in New York City is an over-the-top experience that is certainly sure to smash your budget. I mean, it costs you money just to drive into that city, doesn't it? Just remember, no matter how extravagant or how much your Valentine spends on you, it is the thought that counts. That's this week's Cannabis Coast to Coast News. I'm executive producer Jimmy Young, filling in for Elena Pinto, who is on assignment out of the country, but she should be back next week. So for Kimmy Cannabis, Karen Black, Amie Carter, and the entire Cannabis Coast to Coast News team, I'm Jimmy Young again, and remember to have a great week and a happy Valentine's Day. Remember, it's a whole new world of weed out there. Educate yourself and consume responsibly. So what's your life story? Do you define yourself by your career or by your personal journey? The trick is to tell it in under 15 seconds. Here's mine. I'm Jimmy Young, a 30-year Emmy Award-winning sportscaster from New England who's a teacher and coach in my soul. I've mentored hundreds of young people, but I'm most proud of my only child, a 35-year-old son, Gabriel, who's now a licensed electrician in North Carolina who can fix anything. How about you? If you want to build your confidence enough to walk up to a stranger at a networking event and start a conversation, sign up for my office hours with Professor Jimmy live on Monday nights from 8 to 9 p.m. Now, there's a fee of $1 to hang out with me for that hour, but I'll share some tips so you can tell your life story in 15 seconds. Just log on to ProfessorJimmy.com, and guess what? I'll even give you your $1 back if you don't laugh and learn something that can help you become a better communicator.